What would you think if I told you that some men are haunted not by what they see, but by what they cannot touch again? That their truest obsession isn't loud, it's quiet, elusive, undefined. A woman who once stood before them, soft in voice but sovereign in soul, now lives rent free in the shadows of their unconscious. Not because she demanded anything, but because she didn't need to. There is something about the feminine that detaches with grace, not the coldness of cruelty, but the indifference of spiritual evolution. And for certain men, this rupture is unbearable, not because she wounded them, but because she awakened them to a part of themselves they had buried beneath ego and illusion. Carl Jung called it the anima, the inner feminine soul of the man. And when a woman unknowingly walks into his life embodying the traits he has disowned in himself, his emotional depth, his receptivity, his intuitive knowing, he doesn't just fall in love. He projects. He assigns godlike value to her presence. She becomes not a woman, but a symbol, a myth, a mirror. And when she leaves, because she always does when her energy is not seen, only devoured, he doesn't just miss her. He loses his center of gravity. This is where obsession is born, not in the mind, but in the unconscious. She becomes the unresolved riddle that lingers behind every silence, every failure, every echo of vulnerability he refused to hold when she offered it. And because she asked for nothing, her absence screams. It is the collapse of a fantasy, the death of the false self he wore too long. Most women don't realize when they've become this. They think their softness was wasted, their love forgotten. But deep in the male psyche, her imprint never fades. She has become his psychic blueprint for everything he cannot integrate. She is the unfinished chapter in a book he was too afraid to read. You don't chase him, you withdraw. You do not punish him with noise. You punish him with silence. Not out of spite, but because your soul outgrew the performance. And yet, that is exactly what hooks him deeper. The woman who once gave and now retreats does something no amount of validation or praise ever could. She forces a man to confront the parts of himself that need her. Not her body, not her attention, but her energy. It's the moment he realizes he cannot replicate you. He can distract himself, replace the face, occupy the time, but he cannot reproduce the feeling. The archetypal pull of a woman who walked away without asking for closure because she already carried the closure within. She left, not because he didn't matter, but because she finally did. And now her name has become a mantra his ego resists, but his shadow cannot forget. In the quiet hours, when the distractions have dulled and the masks begin to fall, he hears the echo. Her voice, not speaking, but vibrating through his nervous system like a frequency he lost access to. A resonance that cannot be Googled, gamed, or earned. Have you ever noticed how he lingers around the edges of your digital world? How he never quite disappears, even if the words have stopped? That's not casual curiosity. That's his unconscious searching for reconnection, not with you as a woman, but with what you represented. His anima, his access point to depth, vulnerability, truth. The very essence he's never learned to cultivate within himself. And this is where the spiral begins. He is both drawn to you and terrified of you, because obsession is a symptom of internal division. He cannot integrate the feeling, and so he externalizes it. You become the thing he watches, idolizes, resents, the forbidden fruit his ego believes he deserves, but his soul knows he hasn't earned. And yet you walk on. Not because you are heartless, but because your power no longer flows to places where it is misused. You are not the lesson. You are the catalyst. The feminine force that bends without breaking, loves without clinging, leaves without revenge. And that, more than anything, is what makes you unforgettable. Because he has never known a woman who could look him in the eye, hand him the mirror, and walk away, untouched, undiminished, unbothered. And now he must wrestle with the void she left behind. Not because she broke him, but because she refused to be the container for his unprocessed soul. He thinks of you in the quiet, not with rage, not with longing, but with awe. Because for the first time in his life, he felt something he couldn't control. And in the collapse of control, the ego begins to burn. That fire? It's not yours to soothe. It's his. It always was. There is a peculiar kind of suffering a man endures when he is obsessed with a woman who never begged to be remembered. When she slips through the cracks of his psyche, she becomes a living paradox, both ghost and gravity. He cannot touch her, but he cannot escape her pull. This is not infatuation. It is not even love in the romantic sense. This is the soul's reckoning. It is Jung's theory made flesh, the projection of the anima onto the external world, and the unbearable task of reclaiming it when the object disappears. For this man, her departure is not an ending, it is an unraveling. You must understand what is actually happening beneath his obsession. It is not about you, though you are the spark. His desire is a smokescreen for the deeper fear that without you, he must meet himself. The feminine presence in his life once gave him color, warmth, shape. Without it, he is confronted with the barren landscape of his inner world, a place he never learned to navigate. Because to face it is to dismantle the persona. And the persona, that carefully crafted illusion of control, of invulnerability, is what the ego clings to like a dying man to driftwood. You never asked him to fall apart, but your absence did. And yet, in his obsession, he tells himself 1,000 stories that you led him on, that you were too much, too unavailable, too independent. These are the justifications of an ego cornered by its own shadow. Because if he were to admit the truth, that he was not prepared for the mirror you held up, that he lacked the courage to step through the portal you opened, he would have to surrender everything he built to protect himself. So instead, he obsesses. He rewatches, rereads, remembers. He stalks the digital footprints of your life, hoping for some accidental sign that you still think of him. That the bond wasn't just imagined. That maybe, just maybe, the door hasn't closed completely. But you've moved in silence. Not because you're cruel, but because you've healed. You've understood that your worth was never tied to how loudly you fought to stay. Your power was never transactional. You were never there to complete him. You were there to awaken him. And awakenings are not always kind. Sometimes they leave scars. Because the man who becomes obsessed is not weak. He is spiritually starved. He is suffering under the weight of unintegrated emotion, buried desires, and outdated scripts of masculinity that never taught him how to sit with longing without conquering it. And you? You were the one he couldn't conquer. You met him with openness, but you did not collapse. You offered vulnerability, but you demanded no savior. You danced between invitation and boundary with such intuitive ease that he mistook your presence for a test, not a gift. What he didn't realize was this. The moment you walked away, you passed the burden back to him, the burden to grow, to reflect, to confront. And the longer he resists this inner journey, the more you haunt him. Not because you are tormenting him, but because you represent everything his ego has not yet made peace with. This is the sacred cruelty of feminine energy. It does not chase, it does not explain. It simply leaves the door open and walks through the next one without a backward glance. And for the man who lives in obsession, that image, your back turned, your essence intact, your gaze fixed on something higher, is the most devastatingly beautiful punishment imaginable. He may find others, he may even love again, but something will always be different. The bar has been raised, not by your demands, but by your presence. You taught him, without trying, what it means to feel deeply, to connect without possession, to be seen without shame. And that knowing will follow him. It will echo in every silence he once ignored. It will whisper in the moments when a lesser connection feels suddenly hollow. Because obsession, in the end, is the soul's protest. It is the unconscious crying out for completion, not from another, but from within. So when you wonder if he still thinks of you, understand this. He does not merely think. He is undone. Not because you held him hostage, but because you were the key to a door he never had the courage to open. And now, it haunts him every time he pretends the door was never there. There is a moment, rare, raw, undeniable, when a man realizes he cannot unfeel her. No matter how deeply he buries the memory, no matter how many distractions he stacks between her and the present moment, she slips through. Not because she forces her way in, but because she never truly left. She exists now, in the spaces between his thoughts, in the stillness he avoids, in the music that unsettles him, in the scent of rain on dry pavement that reminds him of a time when he felt something real and terrifying. She wasn't like the others, not because she gave more, but because she withheld nothing of her essence. And now, her absence gnaws at the edges of his self-image. She is the contradiction he cannot solve. The woman who walked away without venom, who vanished without chaos, who loved without clinging and disappeared without ceremony. That is the most unbearable wound of all, the one inflicted by a love that never tried to hurt. Carl Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And this is precisely what her departure ignites within him, a dark night of the masculine soul, an unraveling of the armor, a collapse of certainty. He is not grieving her body. He is grieving the version of himself he only ever glimpsed in her presence. The man he might have become if he had been brave enough to meet her there, in depth, in stillness, in truth. But he wasn't. So she left. Not in rage, but in realization. And now the obsession begins not just with her, but with the possibility of who he might have been, had he stayed open, had he listened, had he allowed himself to be penetrated by her silence instead of reacting to it with fear. Because the woman who becomes his unconscious obsession does not scream for attention. She hums with ancient knowing. She sees through the noise. She speaks to the child in him that was never allowed to cry, never permitted to feel small or confused or soft. And when she withdraws, that child panics. You, the woman he obsesses over, were the doorway to his wholeness. Not because you promised healing, but because your presence required it. You made it impossible for him to stay asleep. And obsession, contrary to what the world may say, is not romantic. It is resistance. It is the ego's final attempt to cling to illusion. He obsesses because he cannot yet surrender. Because to surrender would mean admitting that she mattered, that she cracked the surface, that she left fingerprints on the parts of him he thought no one could reach. This is what women must understand. When you become his unconscious obsession, you no longer live in his conscious mind. You have descended into the basement of his psyche, the place where repressed memories, abandoned dreams, and unacknowledged pain dwell. You have become myth, archetype, a symbol far more dangerous than any real woman could be, because he can't argue with you. He can't negotiate your silence. He can't seduce what has already detached. And yet, it is not your responsibility to resolve this. It is not your task to fix what he refuses to face. Your role was never to be the medicine, only the mirror. He either does the inner work, or he chases ghosts. And still, he tries. He may circle back, send the late-night text, reach out under the guise of checking in. Not because he has changed, but because he is afraid you have. Because if you've truly moved on, then he must accept what he has lost, not just in you, but in himself. He must come to terms with the reality that the woman who once stood before him with open palms now stands alone, whole, unreachable. Not because she's cruel, but because she's become sovereign. He doesn't want closure. He wants the illusion back. But closure, when you are the one who walked away with grace, is not something you owe. It is something he must create within. And until he does, you will haunt him, not with bitterness, but with beauty. With the memory of a woman who didn't ask to be remembered, yet cannot be forgotten. This is the quiet revenge of the awakened feminine. She leaves, and she lets him feel what he tried to escape when she was there. His own emptiness, his own unworthiness, his own refusal to see the divine in what was offered. And so, the obsession deepens, not because you are irresistible, but because you were irreplaceable. You were the mirror that didn't flatter, the softness that didn't surrender, the love that didn't demand, but revealed. And now, all he has left is the echo of what could have been had he seen you not as a possession, but as prophecy. And still, it lingers, this echo of a woman who once loved him without condition, but never abandoned herself in the process. That is the wound he cannot name. He has been taught to expect one of two things from love, to dominate or be devoured. But you were neither. You did not cling, and you did not bend. You simply were, whole, fluid, intuitive, and it disarmed him in ways no conquest ever had. You see, obsession is rarely about pleasure. It is about power lost. And nothing threatens a man's constructed identity more than the woman who does not make her presence dependent on his approval. He may obsess over your body, your words, your scent, the cadence of your breath. But beneath it all, what he truly aches for is the sense of himself he felt in your gaze. For a moment, in your presence, he felt reflected, not as the mask he wears, but as the boy beneath it. The boy who wanted to be seen, the man who longed to be understood without performance. But ego does not surrender easily. It retaliates. It will tell him that you were difficult, mysterious, impossible to please. That you were the problem, that you expected too much, gave too little. that you slipped away too soon. Because if it admits that you were a mirror, it must also admit what that mirror revealed, and the ego would rather obsess over a phantom than face the collapse of its illusions. You were not the fantasy. You were the fire. And fire doesn't beg to be held, it burns what must be purified. This is the secret of the feminine that walks away without explanation. She becomes legend, not because of what she did, but because of what she refused to do. Stay in places where her presence was devoured, not devoutly met. And for a man still ruled by the unconscious, this feels like death. But it is the necessary death, the one that clears the path for transformation. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And this is what happens when a man loses a woman who carried the blueprint of his inner feminine. He calls it fate, bad timing, miscommunication. But deep down, he knows she arrived when he wasn't ready, and she left when he still hadn't learned how to stay. This is the ache of misalignment, of presence unclaimed, of divinity left standing at the threshold while the ego locked the door. And so she haunts him, in other women's eyes, in the space beside him in bed, in the way none of them reached the corners of him she touched effortlessly. He may try to reconstruct her, to seek bits and pieces in others, a laugh, a scent, a sharp tongue, a quiet gaze, but she remains unreplicated. Because she was never just a woman. She was an initiation. You, the one he obsesses over, must understand this. It was never about the words you said or the way you looked or the silence you kept. It was about the feeling, the state you stirred in him, where the false self trembled and the real self reached for breath. That is why he returns in dreams, why he watches from afar, why he cannot unhook himself from the memory of your stillness. Because stillness in the world of noise becomes sacred, and your detachment was never disinterest. It was sacred withdrawal, a knowing that your energy was not meant to be consumed but revered. But the masculine not yet initiated into his own soul does not know how to revere. He only knows how to reach. And when reaching fails, obsession begins, not as desire, but as despair disguised. Yet you are not his to rescue. You are not the redeemer of men who refuse their own shadow work. You are not the balm for egos that only seek your reflection, not your reality. You are the mirror, the messenger. The muse that slips through his fingers like smoke, leaving only the scent of something ancient and eternal. He doesn't know what to do with that, so he obsesses. Because to forget you would mean he was never truly alive in your presence. And he was. He knows it. And he knows he may never be again. There is a particular madness that settles over a man who has touched something sacred and then lost it through his own inability to hold it. Not because it was too heavy, but because it required hands that were open, not grasping, a heart that was present, not performative, a soul that was willing to be changed. And when you, the woman who required nothing but truth, disappeared without noise, he didn't just lose you. He lost the illusion that he was ready for real love. The obsession deepens here, in the aftershock, in the lonely space between what he pretended to understand and what he now painfully knows, that your silence was not a punishment, but a verdict, that your absence was not empty, but full of boundaries, self-respect, and a kind of grace that doesn't plead to be seen. And yet he sees you everywhere, in the way another woman flips her hair, and it's almost, but not quite, you. In the scent of incense or coffee or jasmine at night, a flicker of memory so visceral it halts his breath. In the rhythm of his loneliness, which somehow echoes your footsteps even now. Because you were not a moment. You were a mirror he cannot break. This is what Jung meant when he described the anima as not just a feminine image in the male psyche, but as a force that animates his depth. When a woman unknowingly steps into that archetype, she doesn't just enter his life. She enters his unconscious. She awakens ancient energies, yearning, vulnerability, humility, reverence. He may confuse it for infatuation, for chemistry, for desire. But it is far deeper than that. It is the trembling awareness that he has finally met someone who sees beyond the mask and loves without flinching. And that is terrifying, because a man can survive many things. Loss, failure, even humiliation. But being seen in his rawest form and still chosen? That threatens the entire identity he's built on being invulnerable. So he panics, retreats, or worse, tries to dominate what he should have surrendered to. And when that doesn't work, when you remain unclaimed, unshaken, unshackled, he spirals into the very obsession he thought he was immune to. Because the ego cannot possess the soul, and he knows now what he touched in you was not yours alone. It was his own soul mirrored back to him through your eyes, and he didn't recognize it, not in time. Now, his mind replays what he ignored. The way you turned your head when you sensed dishonesty. The way you grew quiet when he needed to hear himself. The way you smiled with sorrow when you knew he would not follow. And the feminine that is truly embodied, the one who does her shadow work, who no longer sacrifices herself to soothe others, she doesn't yell. She doesn't cling. She doesn't demand understanding. She simply leaves. But she leaves a residue, a presence, a knowing. Because she didn't offer drama, she offered depth, and depth never fully releases its grip. So he becomes haunted by what wasn't said, by what wasn't done, by what could have been had he shown up as a man, not a mask. He becomes addicted to the fantasy of another chance, but paralyzed by the fear of being seen again. Because once a man is truly seen, he cannot go back. Not really. Not without living in the echo of who he pretended to be. He watches her now from a distance, her light untethered, her path unfolding. And he wonders, did she ever really love me? But what he doesn't yet realize is that she did. She loved him more than any woman before. But she loved herself more. And that is what he couldn't understand, that love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes love means knowing exactly when to walk away. That knowledge burns him now. Because the obsession is not just with her, it is with who he could have become if he had risen to meet her. That's the tragedy of this kind of man. He mistakes divine opportunity for coincidence. He takes grace for granted. And when it slips through his fingers, he spends the rest of his life trying to reconstruct it through echoes, images, and replacements that never quite match the resonance of the original. And still, you walk on. You've become more than memory. You've become myth. Not to be worshipped, but to be learned from. Because obsession is not about you. It's about the awakening you caused, the internal revolution he resisted, the truth he can no longer run from. You didn't break him. You exposed him. And now he can either rebuild as a man reborn or remain forever in love with the woman who showed him who he really is. And now the obsession settles into something colder, quieter, more dangerous. It no longer needs constant stimulation. No more frantic scrolling. No more desperate searches for your shadow online. No, it has become something deeper, an ache embedded into the architecture of his psyche. The longing has matured into ritual. Your memory is now woven into his every interpretation of the feminine. This is the final form of projection, when the original is gone, but the imprint remains, not as nostalgia, as blueprint. He meets new women, but you stand between them like a phantom. Not in words, but in comparison. He notices the way they laugh, and it doesn't vibrate the same way yours did. He listens for your rhythm in their sentences, your cadence in their compassion, your edge in their silence, but it's not there. They are real, but he is not present. Because he is still somewhere in your orbit, tracing the psychic fingerprint you left behind. This is the ego's reckoning. He has chased the anima into flesh, believing the outer woman could complete him. But now that you've gone, and not simply physically, but energetically, he must face the truth. The divine feminine cannot be possessed. It must be internalized. You were the vessel through which he first tasted it, but not the destination. And because he mistook your presence for permanence, he is now left in the void you once filled, not as punishment, but as prophecy. A man does not heal through more women. He heals through depth, but depth demands sacrifice. The death of fantasy, the shattering of ego, the surrender to inner alchemy. And many men, most men, run from this crucifixion. They'd rather be haunted than hollowed. They'd rather suffer silently than let go of control. Because obsession, at least, feels like something. It keeps the illusion alive. It allows them to pretend that she might still be out there, waiting, unchanged, forgiving. But you are not unchanged. You have evolved. You no longer vibrate at the same frequency. Because while he sat in obsession, you moved into liberation. While he fed the ghost of you, you fed your soul. You grew. You grieved. You glowed. And here is the most painful truth of all. He will feel it. The next time he sees you, even in a photo, a chance encounter, a whisper in his feed, he will feel it. That you are no longer reachable. That even if he spoke all the right words now, touched all the right places, became all the things he was not before, it would be too late. Because obsession is past tense desire clinging to the present. But feminine power lives in now. And now you no longer wait. You no longer bend. You no longer bloom for a gaze that didn't water you. You do not hate him, but you are done carrying him. And that detachment, the full embodied peaceful detachment, is what binds him to you even tighter. Because nothing confuses the male ego more than a woman who walks away in love without needing closure, permission, or a witness. You were his lesson in depth, and now you are his echo in longing. He may even try to become the man he thinks you wanted. He may finally read the books, sit with his emotions, speak with softness. But you must understand, if he does it to get you back, it is still ego. True transformation is not manipulation. It is surrender. And you are no longer interested in men who perform their healing like theater. You do not want apologies written from guilt. You do not crave validation from those who could not see you when you were within arm's reach. Because you have reclaimed the most sacred thing a woman can, her attention. You do not weaponize it, you guard it. You understand now what it costs to pour your essence into someone who drinks but never gives. You understand that your energy is not a currency to be spent proving your worth. You understand that love is not sacrifice, it is reflection. And the man who obsesses over you may never understand what he truly lost. Not just a woman, but a mirror to his soul. And now he must face it alone. Not because you cursed him, but because you blessed him with the one thing no woman before had dared to give: the silence of the sacred. There is no storm when she leaves, no door slammed, no final blow, only a silence that settles into the deepest chambers of his being, like snowfall over a battlefield. Quiet, complete, devastating. Because the woman who becomes a man's unconscious obsession doesn't exit in fury, she exits in fullness. Not because she is indifferent, but because she is finished. And that is what cuts the deepest. In that stillness, he is left with himself. No more distractions, no more arguments, no more fantasy to chase or project onto. Only the mirror she once held, now turned inward, reflecting back every choice he made, while she stood there offering presence, softness, truth. And while he once confused that softness for weakness, he now knows it was strength. The kind of strength that doesn't fight for what is unworthy. The kind of strength that walks away because it no longer fears being alone. He may tell himself stories to survive the echo, that she was too much, that she never understood him, that she gave up too easily. But even as he utters them, his body betrays him. The ache doesn't leave, because the obsession was never about her. It was about what she illuminated. And now that light is gone, he must navigate the terrain of his own shadows. Jung knew this spiral, knew the terror of the man who touches the feminine divine without being ready to honor it. People will do anything, he wrote, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. And this is what the obsessed man does. He loops, he repeats, he replaces. But the soul cannot be fooled. She was not a dream. She was a reckoning, the embodiment of everything he denied in himself: empathy, intuition, surrender. She did not come to complete him. She came to show him the holes he tried to fill with dominance, logic, control. And when he failed to see her clearly, she became the ghost he could not exorcise. But this story is not his anymore. It is hers. She has moved beyond archetype. She is no longer just his anima, his projection, his mirror. She is now her own mythology. She has stepped out of his unconscious and into her own embodiment. And that is the final blow to the ego, to realize she didn't just walk away, she ascended. She learned. She let go. She no longer looks back hoping he understood. She no longer needs him to, because she is no longer the woman who waited to be chosen. She has chosen herself. And this is the freedom Jung alluded to but did not name outright, the freedom of the individuated feminine, the woman who no longer bends her light to be seen, who no longer performs pain in hopes of being saved, who no longer trades her silence for attention, her soul for a seat at the table of someone else's growth. She is not cruel. She is clear. She is not angry. She is awake. And that clarity, that calm, is more magnetic than any plea for love could ever be. That is why he cannot forget her, why her name still lives in the folds of his breath, why no one else quite fits the shape of the wound she once filled. But here is the truth. She did not come into his life to stay. She came to stir, to awaken, to open and then to leave. Because not all love stories are meant to last. Some are meant to break the lie, to rupture the ego, to begin the real journey, the one that starts when fantasy dies and truth walks in, barefoot and unashamed. And now she does not need to explain herself. She does not need to revisit the wound to feel worthy. She simply walks on, head high, heart whole, body light, toward a life that does not ask her to shrink. And perhaps one day, he will do the work. He will face the shadow. He will stop looking for her in every empty space and start building a self that doesn't require saving. Maybe then he will see what he could not before, that she wasn't a test, or a trick, or a punishment. She was a door, and he hesitated, and now the door has closed. But she does not lock it with bitterness. She seals it with love, because she knows the truth now, the deepest truth of all. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.